In the memory section, we're going to be going over the very basics of what memory means in context of AI agents. And we're going to be kind of working our way through 4 examples. We're going to be going through the very basics of short-term memory. We're going to be going to short-term memory with a notepad, long-term memory with a notepad, and then long-term memory in a more standard format, which is kind of a full-on SQL vector store. Okay, so anything that you need to know about getting memory infrastructure set up for your project, for your agent, you're going to know by the end of this section. So let's go ahead and dive in to the very first topic, which is going to be short-term chat. Okay, so what I want you to do here is if you go over to sections and then in memory, we're going to start with this short-term chat file here. So let me just talk about for a second how we're going to be kind of approaching the different lessons across some of these sections. So we're actually not going to focus too much, at least initially, on writing code. We're going to go more over the why. We have all of the code written for you. We really want to kind of emphasize is the fundamentals of the things that you need to understand. So that you know how to kind of apply these things conceptually into your own project, because it turns out the actual writing code is fairly easy. It's fairly repetitive. What you're going to notice, especially as you start writing agents and writing programs that use agents a lot more in your workflows and in kind of production settings, is you're actually going to find that you're doing a lot of copy and pasting, because once you kind of do something once, you kind of know how to do it every other single time. So before we get really deep into this, one of the things I'll show you is, for example, we have in our database folder here, and we'll explain more of this once we get to the last lesson, so don't stress too much here. But if we go into this memory schema, okay, so one of the things we're going to do in this section is teach you how to build kind of a memories vector store that your AI agent can actually access and retrieve and set different memories. What you can see here, so we have sort of this very basic schema that we've written. We're using a tool called Drizzle to help us with our schemas, but you'll notice that this just compiles down to SQL. And this is really like all something like this is. You're initializing a vector extension here so that you can actually use embeddings within a Postgres database, which, as of recording this, is the number one way that I would recommend using a vector store. This is pretty well established. Almost 99% of you are going to be totally great with this workflow. There's maybe a really small 1% of you that maybe needs something like a dedicated vector database, but I don't think you need to worry about that. And I have worked with a ton of people at this point, so I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of what's going to be able to best serve all of you. But you can see this is like a pretty simple table here. Okay. And the nice thing is, once you have it written for one table, if we write the same table for a bunch of different agents, it's all going to be pretty much the same. Maybe you add a few pieces, a few additional columns that are unique to that particular use case, right? But for the most part, things are going to be pretty much the same. So we're going to focus on what's going on here. So I do recommend, if you want, just as an exercise, to follow along, and maybe you do this as you watch and kind of go through each line and write the code. It's definitely a helpful exercise, but I think especially, at least for kind of the first couple of lessons here, you don't really need to worry about writing code. Obviously, when we actually get to writing and building agents from scratch, definitely we're going to be writing code live and have you following along. But for this is a lot more of conceptual stuff than it is kind of technical code level stuff. So what this program here does, the short-term chat.ts file, this is basically doing the same thing that we did in this intro section, where we're having that kind of command line style chat back and forth with the AI. But what we're doing in this case is that we're eventually going to kind of slowly add different pieces of memory. So let's actually talk for a sec about why we need memory why we need memory for agents. Okay, so one of the things that LLMs don't have is they're missing the ability to store information kind of long term, right? So to take a really basic example, right? If you go into a new chat in ChatGPT or something and you have a conversation with the AI, what you talk about in that chat is not going to be remembered if you go ahead and click the new chat button and start a new chat, right? Those chats are separate instances, which if you think about kind of agents and what they actually mean, right? We in the last section, kind of in the intro, we talked about how agents are very similar to like real world teammates, right? Where you're giving them a task and you're hoping for a certain output, right? And the great thing about humans, right, is we have the ability to process long-term information. We can kind of remember things and write things down. We have databases of information that we can access. And the problem is LLMs, by kind of on their own, they don't really have the ability to do any of that, right? You don't have the ability to keep track of information. You don't have the ability to persist things to long-term storage. So what we need to do is we need to basically build some sort of tool that can supplement the LLM with the ability to kind of do all these long-term memory and these long-term planning steps and all of that. So we're going to kind of go over how to do that and how you should be thinking about that. So there's kind of two different types of memory when it comes to AI agents. There's short-term memory and then there is long-term memory. So short-term memory is another term you'll hear people use quite often with this, is the idea of working memory. So if you're familiar with computers at all, one of the analogies people will make is that your short-term memory is kind of like your RAM, and your long-term memory is kind of like whatever's in your actual storage, right? Your long-term storage, your SSD or whatever. And so that's kind of how we want to think about things. And in the case of AI agents, the way we want to think about short-term memory is you can think about that as things like the system prompt. Okay, so a system prompt is going to be something that the model is always going to have context of, right? Every single time you make a request to that model, it's first going to check its system instructions, make sure it's going through those instructions, and then it's actually going to use those instructions to kind of base the core of its response, right? It's going to combine those system instructions with the chat history, and it's going to output some sort of response. Okay, so its short-term memory is really just the chat history, right? That's basically the core of it. And the way that you affect the model's responses with that short-term chat history, right, is obviously going to be by how you chat with it, which essentially is prompt engineering. So when it comes to short-term memory, typically this isn't something you really need to even think about much. It's just going to be the history of the conversation, which is very similar to what you would expect from a human, right? Like if I'm sitting down for some sort of a meeting with somebody and we're having a conversation about how to solve a task, right? We're both going to have the immediate short-term memory and context as we're kind of going through that, right? But to continue with this meeting analogy, each one of us, right, if I'm meeting one-on-one with somebody, we also have the ability to pull kind of outside information, right? Maybe we had a meeting last week that we want to pull some information from. And so what we need to do is we need to build systems so that the AI can kind of do the same thing. So if we actually just run this short-term chat, this is basically just going to be the same as the intro, but I just kind of want to run it to make a point here. So if we right-click, copy relative to path here, and we do TSX and paste that in, you'll see we get the command line chat. And if I say, what is my name? It's not going to know what my name is, right? It says, I'm sorry, but I don't know your name. I don't have access to personal information, okay? But one of the ways that we could alter, right, it's quote-unquote short-term memory, is we could say, my name is McKay, right? So we're just doing some really basic prompt engineering inside of a system prompt, and we're basically altering its memory, right? Because one of the ways that you can think about system prompts is you're basically, you can imagine you have sort of this teammate, but the teammate only knows what you tell it, right? So you can make the system instructions as long and complex as you want, and it's going to be able to know all this different stuff, right? But if you don't tell it the things it needs to know, right? If you don't give it the appropriate context, it's not going to have any idea what's going on, right? So if we actually rerun this file, okay, so I'm going to hit Control C here to get out of this. That's how you kind of reset this. Then if I hit my up arrow here, you'll see I have the ability to run this again, which we're going to do. And then if I say, hi, what is my name? Right now, it's obviously going to know what my name is, okay? So in a sense, we've done a very basic adjustment of this agent's memory, right? And obviously this isn't an agent that's doing anything. This is sort of like the very most fundamental, basic, simplest possible example of what an agent is, where we just ask it a question, it gives us an answer, right? That's as simple as the kind of the input-output result is. But you can see prompt engineering and altering the system messages, that's going to be a really reliable way to quote unquote change its memory, right? So most people don't really think about prompt engineering this way. You think of it more kind of as instructions, but what you really are doing is you're affecting its memory, right? Like if we gave our system message here a list of like 10 facts, and we were to kind of have a chat back and forth, right? Maybe we copied like an entire Wikipedia page or something into the system instructions here, right? What we're really doing is we're altering its memory, right? We're saying this is the information that you have available and banked up, and the model's actually going to be able to use that to go answer our questions, right? So that's kind of a very basic example of short-term memory. Next, we're going to jump into something that's a little bit, okay, we're just going to slowly work our way up here because I just want to demonstrate how all of these different pieces fit together, why they're useful, how short-term memory differs from long-term memory and all that stuff. So let's actually go ahead and jump into the next example.